Every empire has a queen they forget to fear. Serafina wore the crown for 7 years, smiled through every banquet, blessed every newborn in the capital square, and swallowed every lie her husband carried home on his skin like cheap perfume. The court called her patient, the servants called her kind. But patience and kindness are just the masks worn by women who are counting, and Serafina had been counting for a very long time. Stay with me until the end of this one. If this story hits you where it hurts, drop a like and tell me what city you are watching from tonight. The candles in the east corridor had burned down to nothing by the time the last of the servants cleared the banquet hall. Grease still clung to the long oak tables. Half-empty goblets of wine sat in crooked rows like soldiers too drunk to stand. Somewhere beyond the stone walls, a dog barked twice and went quiet, and the silence that followed pressed against the palace like a hand over a sleeping mouth. Serafina stood at the window of her private chamber on the third floor, her reflection a pale ghost against the black glass. She had not removed the emerald gown from the evening feast. The fabric was heavy, stitched with silver thread along the bodice, and it dug into her ribs with every breath. She did not care. Pain was a thing she had learned to wear like jewelry. Below, in the courtyard, a carriage pulled by two black mares rolled to a stop near the southern gate. The door opened and a woman stepped out. Tall, dark hair falling past her shoulders like a curtain drawn against the world. She moved with the kind of grace that made men stupid and women furious, and the moonlight caught the edges of her face just enough to confirm what Serafina already knew. Evelise. The name tasted like iron on her tongue. She had heard it whispered in hallways for months, seen it scribbled in unsigned letters tucked beneath pillows and sealed with unmarked wax. The affair was the worst-kept secret in the Empire, and yet every soul in this palace walked around it like a puddle in the road, careful not to dirty their shoes. Serafina watched as two royal guards escorted Evelise through the southern gate. One of them glanced up toward the queen's window. He looked away fast. They always did. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass and closed her eyes. Her pulse was steady. Her hands were still. That was the thing nobody understood about her. They expected tears. They expected shattered mirrors and screaming fits and a woman unraveling like thread pulled from a hem. But Serafina had spent her entire life inside a war that never announced itself, and the women who survived those wars were not the ones who screamed. They were the ones who went quiet. A knock came at the door. 3 taps, slow and deliberate. She did not move. Enter. The door opened and Lady Verena stepped inside, her face powdered white, her lips pressed into a line so thin they nearly vanished. She wore a dark velvet robe cinched at the waist, and her gray hair was braided tight against her skull like armor. She was 63 years old and carried herself like a woman who had never once been caught off guard. Serafina's stepmother, the woman who had raised her after her mother bled out on a birthing bed when Serafina was 4, the woman who taught her to curtsy before she taught her to read, the woman who had never once said the words "I love you" without following them with a condition. "You are still awake," Verena said. Not a question, an accusation. "I am." "You saw the carriage." "I did." Verena closed the door behind her and walked to the center of the room, her boots clicking against the stone floor like a clock counting down to something ugly. She looked at Serafina the way a butcher looks at a side of meat, calculating where to make the cut. "Then you know what I am here to say." Serafina turned from the window. "Say it then." Verena's nostrils flared. "Do not play this game with me, girl. I did not climb out of bed at this hour to trade riddles. You know what is happening beneath this roof. You have known for weeks. And you will do what every queen before you has done when a king wanders. You will close your eyes. You will hold your tongue. And you will keep this family from being dragged through the filth of public scandal." Serafina stared at her. The candlelight threw shadows across Verena's face, and for a moment she looked exactly like the woman Serafina remembered from childhood. Hard, immovable, a wall built from expectation and contempt. "You want me to pretend. I want you to survive. There is a difference." "Is there?" Verena's jaw tightened. She took a step closer, lowering her voice to the kind of whisper that was more dangerous than shouting. "Listen to me carefully. You are not the first queen to share a husband with another woman, and you will not be the last. This is not about your feelings. This is about the Empire, about our bloodline, about the position we hold in this court. If you make a scene, if you cry, if you so much as flinch in front of the nobles tomorrow, everything I have built for this family collapses. Do you understand me?" Serafina felt her fingers curl at her sides. "Not into fists. Not yet." "Everything you have built." "Yes." "For this family." "Yes." And what about what he is doing to me? Verena blinked, just once. Then her expression hardened again, like wet clay drying in the sun. A king's desires are not a wife's concern. They are a wife's burden. You carry it, or you break beneath it. Those are the only choices. The words hit Seraphina somewhere deep and cold, in the place where she kept every insult she had ever swallowed, every humiliation she had ever folded into a smile. She looked at Verena and saw, for the first time with absolute clarity, that this woman did not fear betrayal. She feared the loss of power more than the loss of dignity, and she expected her stepdaughter to feel the same. Seraphina said nothing for a long time. The silence filled the room like smoke. "Get out," she finally said. Verena's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me." "I said get out of my chamber. Now. You ungrateful little— Now." Verena stood there, trembling with a fury she could barely contain. Her lips parted, closed, parted again. Then she turned on her heel and walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the iron latch and spoke without turning around. "If you ruin this, I will make sure you regret it for the rest of your miserable life." The door slammed shut behind her. Seraphina stood alone in the flickering light. She pressed her palm flat against her chest and felt her own heartbeat, steady and relentless, like a drum calling soldiers to a field they had not yet seen. She thought about her mother, a woman she barely remembered, a woman who had died in a bed soaked with blood, while the Empire celebrated the birth of a healthy daughter and forgot the body that delivered her. She thought about every queen who had walked these halls before her, every woman who had smiled through the poison and called it duty. Something shifted behind her eyes. Not rage, not grief. Something colder, something with teeth. She crossed the room to her writing desk and pulled open the bottom drawer. Inside, beneath a stack of old letters and a bundle of dried lavender, was a leather folio she had been assembling for the past 3 months. She opened it and spread the contents across the desk. Letters in Evelise's handwriting. Financial ledgers showing gold transfers to names that did not exist. A list of royal guards who had received payments from accounts traced back to a merchant house in the eastern provinces. A house with no trade goods and no ships. And at the bottom, a single piece of parchment sealed with the crest of House Verena. Seraphina looked at the documents the way a general looks at a map before battle. Every line, every number, every name. She had gathered this evidence piece by piece, night after night, while the palace slept and the king lay tangled in another woman's sheets. Nobody had helped her. Nobody had asked if she was all right. She had done this alone, in the dark, with nothing but her own mind and a fury so deep it had become indistinguishable from calm. She placed the folio back in the drawer and locked it with a key she wore on a chain around her neck. Then she sat on the edge of her bed and stared at the far wall. Tomorrow, the court would gather. Tomorrow, the nobles would watch her face for cracks. Tomorrow, Verena would expect obedience, and Lucien would expect silence, and Evelise would expect nothing at all because women like Evelise never expected consequences. Seraphina lay back against the pillows and let the darkness swallow her. She did not sleep. She planned. The morning came gray and cold, and the palace woke to the sound of bells ringing from the cathedral tower across the square. Servants moved through the corridors carrying trays of bread and salted meat. Stable boys led horses to water. The empire turned like a wheel, grinding forward on the backs of people who would never see the inside of a throne room. Seraphina rose before dawn. She washed her face with cold water from a basin on her nightstand and dressed herself without calling for her attendants. She chose a gown of deep charcoal, severe and unadorned, and pulled her hair back tight against her skull. No jewels, no perfume, no softness. Then she walked to the vault. The royal vault sat beneath the palace chapel, behind a door of iron and oak that required 2 keys to open. Seraphina had one. The other belonged to the master of the crown treasury, a thin man named Aldrich, who had served 4 monarchs and trusted none of them. She found him in the corridor outside, already dressed, already waiting, as though he had known she would come. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing slightly. "Open the vault, Aldrich." He studied her face for a moment. Something flickered in his old eyes. Recognition, maybe. Or fear. He pulled the key from a chain around his neck and turned it in the lock. Seraphina did the same with hers. The door groaned open. Inside the vault was cold and dry, lined with shelves of dark wood that held the treasures of the empire. Gold, jewels, deeds to land, treaties signed in blood. And on a stand of black velvet in the center of the room, beneath a glass dome thick with dust, sat the silver crown. It was old, older than the palace, older than the Ashford dynasty itself. The first Alpha Queens had worn it before the empire had a name, back when the land was divided into warring territories, and the only law was the strength of the woman who held the border. The crown was not beautiful, it was not delicate. It was a thing forged in fire and hammered into shape by hands that had never known softness. Its surface was etched with symbols so ancient that no living scholar could translate them, and the silver had darkened over the centuries into a color that was closer to storm clouds than moonlight. No queen had worn it in over 100 years. The last one who did had used it to declare war on 3 kingdoms at once, and won all 3. The crown was not a decoration, it was a threat. Serafina lifted the glass dome and set it aside. She picked up the crown with both hands. It was heavier than she expected. The metal was cold against her palms, and for a moment she felt something move through her, a current of something ancient and furious and alive, like a river that had been dammed for too long. She placed it on her head. Aldrich said nothing. He simply stared at her with an expression she had never seen on his weathered face. It took her a moment to realize what it was. Hope. Aldrich. Yes, Your Majesty. Tell no one what you saw this morning. When the court assembles, you will stand at the north entrance and wait for my signal. Do you understand? I understand. And Aldrich. Yes. Thank you. He bowed again, deeper this time, and when he straightened there was something like defiance in his old eyes. The defiance of a man who had waited decades for someone to finally do what needed to be done. Serafina left the vault and climbed the stairs back to the main hall. The silver crown sat on her head like it had been waiting for her. She could feel its weight pressing down on her skull, not uncomfortable but present, constant, a reminder of what she was about to become. The grand hall filled slowly. Nobles arrived in clusters, their voices low, their eyes restless. Word had spread overnight, the way it always did in a palace where the walls had ears and the servants had loose tongues. The queen had not wept, the queen had not raged. The queen had gone to the vault at dawn and taken the silver crown. Nobody knew what it meant, and that was precisely what made it terrifying. Serafina entered through the east doors. Every conversation died. Every head turned. She walked the length of the hall with the silver crown catching the light from the high windows. And the silence that followed her was not the silence of respect. It was the silence of animals sensing a storm. She took her seat at the right hand of the throne. Lucian's chair was empty. It was always empty in the mornings. He rarely appeared before noon, and when he did, he carried the look of a man who had slept in someone else's bed and could not quite remember why. The nobles stared. Lady Marcella of House Devereux leaned toward her husband and whispered something behind her fan. Lord Ashton of the Eastern Province adjusted his collar and looked at the floor. General Theron, the commander of the Empire's western armies, stood near the back wall with his arms crossed and his jaw set, watching Serafina the way a hunter watches a hawk circling above a field. He was the only one in the room who did not look afraid. Serafina let the silence stretch. She understood its power. Silence was a weapon only the patient could wield, and she had been patient long enough to sharpen it into a blade. "Good morning," she said. Her voice carried across the hall without effort. Flat, calm, dangerous. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Lord Dunmore, a fat man with red cheeks and a reputation for cowardice, cleared his throat and stepped forward. "Your Majesty, if I may, the crown you wear. It is unusual. It is mine." Of course, of course. I only meant that it has not been seen in quite some time, and some may wonder. Let them wonder." Dunmore opened his mouth, closed it, and retreated back into the crowd like a dog that had been swatted on the nose. Serafina watched him go and felt nothing. These people had watched her husband betray her in plain sight and done nothing. They did not deserve explanations. They deserved consequences. The morning session proceeded with the usual tedium. Land disputes, tax grievances, a border conflict with the northern territories that had been festering for months. Serafina listened to each matter with the same flat expression, and when she spoke her words were precise and final. No room for debate, no invitation for counsel. The nobles exchanged glances. This was not the queen they knew. It was nearly midday when the doors at the far end of the hall opened and Lucian walked in. I was tall, broad-shouldered, a jaw carved from the same stone as his ancestors, and eyes the color of iron in winter. He moved the way powerful men always move, with the assumption that the world would rearrange itself around him. His tunic was fresh, his boots polished, and his face carried the easy confidence of a man who believed his sins had been forgiven before he committed them. He stopped when he saw the crown. For a fraction of a second, something crossed his face. Not guilt, not fear. Something closer to confusion, the expression of a man who had walked into a room expecting furniture and found a fire instead. Serafina. My king. He approached the throne and sat down, his eyes moving between the crown and her face as though trying to solve a puzzle he had not known existed. The court watched. The air thickened. That crown, he said, keeping his voice low enough that only she could hear. Why are you wearing that? Because it belongs to me. It has not been worn in 112 years, I am aware. His jaw tightened. People will talk. People have been talking, Lucian, about many things. I am simply giving them something new to discuss. He held her gaze for a long moment, searching for the woman he was used to. The soft one. The quiet one. The one who smiled through dinner and asked no questions when he disappeared after midnight. He did not find her. We should speak privately, he said. We should, but not today. Lucien's hand gripped the armrest of his throne. His knuckles went white. He was not accustomed to being refused, least of all by the woman he had married. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the doors burst open again, and a figure stumbled into the hall. It was Captain Roderick, one of the royal guards assigned to the southern gate. His uniform was disheveled, his face flushed, and his eyes were wide with the particular terror of a man who has just discovered that his secrets are no longer secret. Your Majesties, he said, dropping to one knee, I must speak with the king, immediately, in private. Lucian frowned. What is this about? Roderick's eyes darted to Serafina. She saw it, the fear, the recognition. He knew something, and he knew that she knew he knew it. It concerns security matters, Your Majesty. Sensitive in nature. Serafina leaned forward in her chair. Captain Roderick, is this about the payments you received last month from a merchant house in the eastern provinces? The one registered under the name Hallow and Cross? Because if it is, I would suggest you choose your next words very carefully. The silence that followed was absolute. Roderick's face drained of color. His knee trembled against the stone floor. Behind him, the nobles pressed forward, straining to hear. Lucian turned to Serafina. What are you talking about? She did not look at him. She kept her eyes on Roderick, pinned to the floor like an insect under glass. Captain, I asked you a question. Roderick's mouth opened and closed. Sweat broke across his forehead. He looked at Lucien, then back at Serafina, then at the floor. Your Majesty, I can explain. I am sure you can. But first I want you to tell the court who instructed you to open the southern gate last night without logging the entry in the guard ledger. Tell them who paid you 40 gold marks to ensure no one recorded the arrival of a carriage bearing no house crest. And tell them where that carriage came from. Roderick's hands shook. He pressed them flat against his thigh to stop the trembling, but it did not work. The entire court was watching now. There was no escape, no door he could slip through, no lie big enough to fill the hole that was opening beneath his feet. It was an arrangement, Your Majesty. I was told it was approved by persons of authority. Which persons? Which persons, Captain? His voice came out cracked and thin, like a beam about to snap. Lady Verena, Your Majesty, she arranged it through an intermediary, a man named Cresswell. He handles logistics. The murmur that swept through the court was not a whisper. It was a roar barely contained. Lord Ashton gripped the arm of the man beside him. Lady Marcella's fan went still in her hand. General Theron uncrossed his arms and straightened, his eyes sharp as a blade freshly drawn. Lucia sat rigid on his throne. His face had turned to granite. Verena arranged what exactly? Roderick swallowed hard. The meetings, Your Majesty, between the woman called Evelise and yourself. Lady Verena arranged the schedule, the payments to the guards, the routes through the palace. All of it. She has been managing it for months. The words landed like stones thrown into still water. Ripples spread across the court. Nobles looked at each other with expressions that ranged from shock to grim satisfaction to naked terror, depending on how close their own secrets sat to the surface. Lucien stood. The scrape of his chair against the stone floor echoed through the hall like a crack of thunder. His face was dark. His fists were clenched at his sides. He turned to Serafina, and for the first time in their marriage, she saw something in his eyes that was not arrogance or indifference. It was doubt. You knew, he said. You knew about all of this. I know about more than this. How long? Long enough. He stared at her. The silver crown glinted on her brow, ancient and unforgiving, and in that moment the distance between them was not the width of two thrones. It was the width of an empire built on lies. Seraphina, not here, she said. Not now. I am not finished. She turned back to the court and raised her voice so that every soul in the grand hall could hear. Captain Roderick will be escorted to the garrison and held for formal questioning. Any guard who received payment from the merchant house known as Hallow and Cross will present themselves to General Theron by sundown. Failure to do so will be treated as an act of treason against the crown. Roderick was dragged to his feet by two soldiers who had appeared from the side corridor. He did not resist. His face was the color of ash. Seraphina stood and looked out over the court. Every face was turned toward her. Every breath was held. She could feel the weight of the silver crown pressing into her skull, and she welcomed it the way a soldier welcomes the weight of armor before walking into a battle that will not be clean. This court is adjourned for the day. Tomorrow morning, I will address the full council regarding matters of state security that have been allowed to fester for too long. Attendance is not optional. She turned and walked toward the east doors. Her back was straight. Her stride was even. She did not look at Lucian. Behind her, the court erupted. In the corridor outside the grand hall, Seraphina moved quickly. Her attendants tried to follow, but she waved them away with a sharp gesture. She needed to reach General Theron before the wolves began circling. She found him in the armory, standing beside a rack of swords that had not been used in years, running his thumb along the edge of a blade with the casual ease of a man who had drawn blood more times than he cared to count. He was 51 years old, lean as a whip, with a face that looked like it had been carved from dried wood and left in the rain. He had served the empire for 30 years and owed his loyalty to the throne, not to the man sitting on it. Your Majesty, he said, without looking up. General, you heard. I heard. And? He set the blade down and turned to face her. His eyes were steady, dark, unyielding. I have been waiting for someone to pull that thread for a long time. The Guard Corps has been compromised for months. I reported it to the King's Council twice. Both times the reports were buried. Buried by whom? Lord Chancellor Whitmore, on instructions from Lady Verena. Seraphina felt the cold current again, the one that had moved through her when she first picked up the crown. It was not anger, it was certainty. How deep does it go? Theron crossed his arms. Deeper than bribed guards, Your Majesty. The woman Evelise, she is not what she appears. I know. Do you know about the letters? Seraphina met his gaze. I have copies of 7. How many more are there? Something shifted in Theron's expression. It was subtle, barely a flicker, but she caught it. Surprise. He had not expected her to already be this far ahead. At least a dozen, he said. Military positions. Troop movements along the northern border. Supply routes for the western campaign. Someone has been feeding detailed intelligence to the Ryland Confederacy for the past 4 months. The information matches what Evelise had access to through her proximity to the king. The weight of what he was saying settled over Seraphina like a second crown, heavier than the first. This was not just an affair. This was not just a husband's betrayal and a stepmother's ambition. This was espionage. This was treason on a scale that could bring the empire to its knees. The council meeting tomorrow, she said. I need you standing beside me, not behind me, beside me. Theron studied her for a long moment. Then he reached out and took the sword from the rack, the one he had been testing, and held it by the blade, offering the hilt to her. I have served 4 monarchs in this empire, Your Majesty. 3 of them were fools. You are not. Seraphina took the sword. Its weight felt right in her hand, balanced and sure, and she understood that what he was offering was not a weapon. It was an oath. Tomorrow, then, she said. Tomorrow. She left the armory and walked the long corridor back toward her chambers. The palace was alive with whispers now. Servants pressed themselves against walls as she passed, their eyes wide, their hands trembling. Word traveled fast in a place like this. By nightfall, every soul in the capital would know that the Queen had worn the silver crown and that Captain Roderick had been arrested and that something was coming that could not be stopped. She rounded the final corner and found Lady Verena waiting at the door to her chamber. Her stepmother's face was a mask of controlled fury. Her hands were clasped in front of her, her knuckles white, her jaw set so tight the tendons stood out in her neck like ropes pulled to breaking. What have you done? Verena said. Not a question. What needed to be done? You have no idea what you have started. No idea. You think you can humiliate me in front of the entire court and walk away unscathed. You think those generals and advisors will protect you when the real power in this palace turns against you? Seraphina stopped in front of her, close enough to see the lines around Verena's eyes, the ones that powder could not hide. close enough to smell the rosewater and the desperation underneath it. You arranged it, Serafina said. Her voice was low and flat, a voice scraped clean of everything except the truth. You brought Evelise into this palace. You paid the guards. You managed the schedule. You did this to me, Verena. Not to a queen. To me. The girl you raised. The girl who called you mother because she had no one else. Verena's left eye twitched. Just once. A tiny fracture in the mask. Everything I did was to protect this family. This is not a family. This is a machine. And I am done being ground between its gears. Verena took a step closer. Her voice dropped to a hiss. You are playing a game you cannot win. Evelise has allies you do not know about. Powerful people. People who will crush you the moment you become inconvenient. Then they should have crushed me before I found the letters. Something shifted in Verena's face. The fury did not disappear, but beneath it, something else surfaced. Something old and ugly and afraid. What letters? Serafina let the silence answer for her. She held Verena's gaze until the older woman looked away. And in that small flinch, that tiny act of surrender, Serafina saw the truth she had always known, but never allowed herself to believe. Verena was afraid of her, had always been afraid of her. Every lesson about obedience, every lecture about duty, every slap disguised as correction, all of it had been designed to keep Serafina small, because Verena had seen what she was, had seen it from the beginning, and she had spent 23 years trying to bury it. Go to your chambers, Verena, Serafina said. Pack what you need. Tomorrow, everything changes. Verena stood there for a long moment, trembling. Then she turned and walked down the corridor, her footsteps sharp and uneven. The footsteps of a woman who had just realized that the ground beneath her was no longer solid. Serafina entered her chamber and locked the door behind her. She removed the silver crown and set it on the desk beside the leather folio. Then she sat in the chair and stared at both objects, side by side. The crown and the evidence. Power and proof. Outside, the sun was setting over the capital. The sky burned orange and red, and the shadows of the palace towers stretched across the courtyard like dark fingers reaching for something just out of grasp. Tomorrow she would stand before the Grand Council. Tomorrow she would lay out every document, every letter, every transaction. Tomorrow she would name names and demand answers and force this empire to look at the rot it had been pretending did not exist. But tonight, in the quiet of her chamber, with the weight of the crown still pressing into her memory and the taste of iron still on her tongue, Serafina allowed herself one moment of something she had not felt in years. Not hope, not triumph. Grief. Grief for the marriage she had believed in. Grief for the girl who had trusted a king to be a man. Grief for the version of herself that had died slowly, night by night, in a palace full of people who saw everything and said nothing. She closed her eyes and breathed. When she opened them again, the grief was gone. In its place was something harder, something forged in 7 years of silence and 3 months of gathering proof in the dark. She reached for the folio and opened it. Inside, beneath the financial ledgers and guard payments and Evelise's letters, was one final document she had not yet examined in full. A manifest. Shipping records from the eastern port of Ashenmoor, detailing the movement of cargo that did not match any known trade route. The cargo was listed as agricultural supplies, grain, seed, iron tools. But the weight did not match. The numbers were wrong by a factor that could not be explained by clerical error. Someone was moving weapons through Ashenmoor under the cover of grain shipments, and the manifest bore the seal of a house that should have had no business in the eastern provinces at all. House Verena. Serafina stared at the document. Her hands were steady. Her breath was even. But somewhere deep inside, in the place where the girl she used to be still lived, a door slammed shut and locked from the inside. This was no longer about a husband and a mistress. This was no longer about pride or betrayal or a stepmother's cruelty. This was about the empire itself, and someone in this palace was selling it to the enemy. Ghi nhận yêu cầu tiếp tục kịch bản theo đặc tả chi tiết. Ghi nhận yêu cầu tiếp tục kịch bản theo đặc tả chi tiết. The manifest lay open on the desk like a wound that refused to close. Serafina had not moved from the chair in 3 hours. The candle beside her had burned down to a stub, wax pooling across the wood in pale rivers, and the only sound in the chamber was her own breathing, slow and deliberate, the breathing of a woman teaching herself not to shake. Weapons. Not grain. Not seed. Not iron tools for farmers who would never see them. Weapons moving through Ashenmoor under forged documents stamped with her stepmother's seal. The numbers were precise. Dates, tonnage, port fees paid in cash to harbormaster accounts, that looped back through 3 shell merchants before vanishing into ledgers she could not trace further without help. She needed Theron. She needed him now, not tomorrow, not at the council session, not when the sun came up in the palace filled with nobles who would smile to her face and send riders to Verena the moment her back was turned. She needed the general in this room, looking at these numbers, telling her whether what she was seeing meant what she thought it meant. Serafina stood. Her knees ached from sitting so long, and her neck was stiff, and the emerald gown from the banquet still hung in the corner of the room, like the shed skin of someone she used to be. She pulled a dark cloak from the wardrobe, fastened it at the throat, and tucked the manifest inside the leather folio. Then she opened the door. The corridor was empty. Past midnight, the palace belonged to rats and shadows, and the occasional guard walking a route he had walked 1,000 times before with eyes that saw nothing. She moved quickly, staying close to the walls, her boots silent on the stone. She knew every turn, every staircase, every passage the servants used when they did not want to be seen. She had learned this palace the way a prisoner learns a cell, by necessity, by repetition, by the slow understanding that knowing the shape of your cage is the first step toward breaking out of it. She found Theron in the officers' quarters behind the western barracks. He was awake. A single lamp burned on the table beside him, and he was reading a letter that he folded and pocketed the moment she appeared in the doorway. Your Majesty, you should not be here alone. And yet here I am. She stepped inside and closed the door. I need you to look at something. She laid the manifest on the table between them. Theron picked it up, and she watched his face as he read. His expression did not change. That was the thing about men who had spent decades at war. They did not flinch at information. They absorbed it the way dry earth absorbs rain, silently, completely, and whatever grew from it came later. He set the manifest down. Where did you get this? A clerk in the Ashenmore Port Authority. He owed a debt to a woman named Ilara, who works in my household. I had Ilara collect. You have been running your own intelligence network. I have been surviving. Call it whatever you want. Theron looked at her. The lamplight carved deep lines into his face and turned his eyes into something that burned low and steady, like coals that had been glowing for hours. The weight discrepancies here. If these numbers are accurate, someone moved enough steel through that port to arm 2,000 men. Maybe more. Under the seal of House Verena. Under a seal that could be forged. Could be. But was not. I have 3 other documents linking Verena to the merchant house that brokered the shipments. She used the same intermediary she used to pay the palace guards, a man named Cresswell. Cresswell. Theron said the name like he was biting into something rotten. I know that name. He brokered mercenary contracts during the Thornfield Rebellion, disappeared after the war. Everyone assumed he was dead. He is very much alive, and he has been operating out of a warehouse on the eastern docks for the past 6 months. Theron leaned back in his chair. The wood groaned under him. He ran a hand across his jaw, rough with stubble, and stared at the ceiling for a long moment before speaking. Your Majesty, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me straight. Ask. Do you believe your stepmother is arming an enemy force to move against the Empire? Serafina felt the question settle into her chest like a stone dropped into deep water. She had been circling it for hours, approaching it and retreating, testing its edges the way you test ice before stepping onto a frozen lake. She did not want to say it. Saying it made it real. Saying it meant that the woman who had braided her hair as a child and taught her to hold a fork and slapped her across the mouth when she spoke out of turn at dinner had not merely betrayed her. She had betrayed everything. I believe, Serafina said, that Verena has spent her entire life building power she was never meant to have. And I believe that when she realized I would not break under Lucian's betrayal, she understood that her position in this court was finished. A woman like Verena does not accept defeat. She escalates. Arming a foreign enemy is not escalation. It is treason punishable by death. Yes. And the woman Evelise, where does she fit? Evelise is the conduit. She had access to the king's private chambers, which means she had access to military dispatches, campaign maps, border patrol schedules. Verena placed her there deliberately. The affair was never about Lucian's weakness. It was about intelligence. Evelise was gathering information and passing it out of the palace through channels Verena controlled. Theron was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed. Lower. Harder. The voice of a man who had just moved from theory to action. The Ryland Confederacy has been testing our northern border for months, probing attacks, small raids. Nothing large enough to justify a full military response, but enough to keep our forces stretched. If they received our patrol schedules and supply routes, It would explain the precision of their strikes. They have been hitting us where we are thinnest, because someone told them where thin was. Yes, Serafina sat down across from him. The chair was hard and uncomfortable, built for soldiers, not queens, and she did not care. Tomorrow I stand before the Grand Council. I present the guard payments, the letters, the financial ledgers. I name Evelise as an intelligence asset and Verena as her handler. But if I present the manifest, if I accuse a member of the royal household of arming a foreign enemy, I need military authority standing behind me. Not beside me. Behind me. The council will not accept this from a queen alone. You want me to mobilize. I want you to be ready. If the council fractures, if Verena's allies try to block the investigation, I need the army's loyalty to be visible and unambiguous. Theron studied her face. She could feel him measuring her the way he measured terrain before a battle, calculating risk, counting the dead before a single sword was drawn. Then he nodded. I will have the garrison commanders assembled by dawn. Loyal men. Men I have bled beside. But your majesty, you need to understand something. Say it. Once you present that manifest, there is no path backward. Verena will not fold quietly. She will burn every bridge between here and the border to protect herself. And if the Ryland Confederacy learns that we have discovered the intelligence breach, they may accelerate whatever they have been planning. You will not be fighting a courtroom battle. You will be fighting a war on two fronts. Serafina looked at the manifest on the table. The numbers stared back at her, cold and absolute, a language that did not lie. I have been fighting a war on two fronts for 7 years, General. The only difference is that now I am choosing my own weapons. Theron almost smiled. Almost. The corner of his mouth twitched and then flattened as though his face had forgotten how. He stood and extended his hand. Not to shake. To grip. The grip of a soldier sealing a pact that words alone could not hold. She took it. His hand was rough and scarred and warm, and it closed around hers with a pressure that said everything his voice did not. Dawn, then, he said. Dawn. She left the barracks and moved back through the silent palace. The corridors were darker now. The torches along the walls had burned low, and the shadows between them stretched like gaps in a fence, wide enough for a body to pass through unseen. She kept one hand on the folio inside her cloak, and the other on the wall, feeling her way by touch, by memory, by the stubborn refusal to be afraid in a house that had tried to teach her nothing but fear. She was halfway to her chamber when she heard the footsteps. They came from behind her, soft, measured, too deliberate to be a servant and too quiet to be a guard. She stopped. The footsteps stopped. She turned. The corridor was empty, or appeared to be. The torchlight did not reach the far end, and the darkness there was thick and shapeless. She stood still, breathing through her nose, her pulse climbing despite everything she told herself about control. Then a voice came out of the dark. You move fast for a queen. Serafina's hand tightened on the folio. The voice was male, calm, unaccented. The kind of voice that belonged to a man who had no need to raise it because the things he did in silence were loud enough. Show yourself, she said. A figure stepped forward, medium height, lean build, a face that was unremarkable by design, the sort of face you would pass in a crowd and never remember. He wore dark clothes, no house crest, no insignia, and his hands hung loose at his sides the way a swordsman's hands hang when he does not yet need to draw. My name is Cresswell, he said, and I think we need to have a conversation. Serafina did not move. Her body went still the way a deer goes still when it hears a branch crack, every muscle locked, every sense pointed at the threat. Cresswell, the intermediary, the ghost between Verena and Evelise and whatever army was being built on the other side of the border with stolen steel and stolen secrets. He was standing 10 feet from her in a dark corridor in the middle of the night, and he was smiling. Lady Verena sends her regards, he said. She asked me to deliver a message. I am not interested in messages from Verena. You will be interested in this one. He took a single step closer. His eyes caught the faint torchlight and held it, flat and steady, the eyes of a man who had looked at death so many times it had become boring. The manifest you found tonight, the shipping records from Ashenmoor. Lady Verena knows you have them. She has known since the moment your little household spy pulled them from the port clerk's office. The cold that moved through Serafina now was not the cold of fear. It was the cold of understanding. Verena had let her find the documents, had let her believe she was ahead, had let her walk into this corridor with a folio full of evidence that was supposed to be her weapon, and then sent the man who built the weapon to meet her in the dark. You are wondering whether this is a trap, Cresswell said. His voice was almost gentle. It is not. At least, not the kind you are imagining. Lady Verena does not want you dead, Your Majesty. Dead queens create martyrs. She wants you discredited. She wants you to stand before the Grand Council tomorrow with your evidence and your generals and your silver crown, and she wants you to fail so completely that no one in this empire ever takes you seriously again. And how does she plan to accomplish that? Cresswell's smile widened. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a man watching a building he had wired begin to smoke. Because every document in that folio, Your Majesty, every letter, every ledger, every payment record you have spent 3 months collecting in secret has been mirrored. Verena has identical copies, and by morning she will have distributed them to every member of the Grand Council with a single devastating alteration. Seraphina's breath caught. Just for a moment, a fraction of a second she could not control. The documents your council receives will show that the payments to the guards, the intelligence leaks, the arms shipments through Ashenmore, all of it, were authorized not by Lady Verena, but by you. The torch behind Seraphina guttered. A draft moved through the corridor like a breath drawn by the palace itself, and the shadows shifted around them, rearranging the dark into new shapes. She has forged the evidence, Seraphina said, not a question. She has improved it. Every seal, every signature, every financial trail now leads back to the Queen. You will stand before the council with your accusations and your proof, and Verena will stand behind you with the same proof rewritten to hang you. It will be your word against hers. And in this empire, Your Majesty, when a queen accuses a noblewoman of treason and the noblewoman accuses the queen of the same, the court does not ask who is telling the truth. It asks who has more friends. Seraphina stared at him. Her fingers were white on the folio. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, but her face showed nothing, gave nothing, because she had spent a lifetime learning how to bleed without letting it show. Why are you telling me this? Cresswell tilted his head. Because Lady Verena is paying me to deliver a message, and I always deliver what I am paid for. But she is not paying me to care about the outcome. I am a courier, Your Majesty, not a loyalist. You are telling me you can be bought. I am telling you that everyone can be bought. The only question is the currency. He stepped back into the shadows. His face disappeared first, then his body, then even the sound of his breathing, until the corridor was empty again, and Seraphina stood alone with a folio full of evidence that had just become a loaded weapon pointed at her own head. She pressed her back against the cold stone wall and closed her eyes. Her hands were trembling. She let them. There was no one here to see. Verena had been ahead of her. Not by days. By months. Every document Seraphina had gathered, every secret she had unearthed, every night she had spent believing she was building a case against her enemies, Verena had been watching, adjusting, preparing a mirror version of the truth that would shatter against Seraphina's the moment they collided. The council meeting was in 6 hours. In 6 hours, she would either expose a traitor or become one in the eyes of every noble in the empire. Seraphina opened her eyes. The corridor stretched before her, dark and silent and indifferent. She pushed herself off the wall and walked. Not back to her chamber, not to Theron, not to anyone who could help her, because in this moment, standing at the edge of a fall she had not seen coming, she understood something that settled into her bones like winter settling into stone. Help was not coming. It never had been. Every ally she had gathered, every oath she had received, every hand extended in loyalty, all of it rested on the assumption that she was right, and that being right was enough. It was not enough. It had never been enough. She reached the end of the corridor and stopped at the top of the staircase that led down to the palace archives. Below, in the dark, were records going back 200 years, tax rolls, military commissions, marriage contracts, birth ledgers, death certificates. Every lie this empire had ever told itself, written down and filed away and forgotten. Somewhere in those records was the thing Verena had not accounted for, the thing no forger could replicate, the thing that would make the difference between accusation and proof. Seraphina descended the stairs into the dark, and the dark swallowed her whole. Orchestrated narrative pivot, revealing betrayal's devastating consequences. Orchestrated narrative pivot, revealing betrayal's devastating consequences. The archives smelled like dust and rot, and the slow death of things nobody cared enough to preserve. Seraphina moved between the shelves with one hand trailing along the spines of ledgers so old the leather had cracked and curled like dead leaves. The dark was almost total. She had taken a candle from the sconce at the top of the stairs, and its flame threw her shadow across the walls in long, distorted shapes that bent and twisted with every step, as though the archive itself was watching her and could not decide what she was. She did not know exactly what she was looking for. That was the worst part. Cresswell's words had torn a hole in the center of her plan, and now she was down here in the guts of the palace, surrounded by 2 centuries of imperial records, searching for something she could only describe as the thing Verena missed, the thing a forger could not replicate, the thing that existed not because someone created it, but because someone forgot to destroy it. Her fingers stopped on a ledger bound in dark red leather. The spine read Royal Household Accounts, years 319 to 324. She pulled it from the shelf and opened it on the nearest table. The pages were brittle and stained with water damage along the edges, and the handwriting was small and precise, the handwriting of a clerk who understood that numbers outlived the people who made them. She turned pages for 20 minutes. 30. Her eyes burned. The candle flickered. She found entries for stable maintenance, kitchen supplies, fabric purchases for the royal wardrobe, wages paid to groundskeepers and laundrywomen and the men who cleaned the chimneys twice a year. Ordinary numbers. The boring skeleton of an empire that ran on bread and soap and the sweat of people whose names appeared nowhere except in columns like these. Then she found it. Not a number. A name. Buried in a list of household staff transfers from year 321, 7 lines from the bottom of a page, so water damaged that the ink had bled into pale blue ghosts of the words they once were. The entry read, Cresswell, M., transferred from Eastern Garrison to Royal Household Staff. Authorization, Lady Verena Ashford. Purpose, special duties, unspecified. Serafina stared at the entry. Her breath came shallow and fast, not from fear, but from the particular vertigo of realizing that the story you thought you were living was not the story at all. Cresswell had not been hired recently. He had not appeared when the affair began or when Evelise arrived at court. He had been embedded in the royal household for 5 years. 5 years of special duties, unspecified. 5 years of moving through the palace like a shadow, with Verena's name stamped on his transfer papers. This was not a conspiracy that had grown around the affair. The affair had grown around the conspiracy. Verena had been building this machine for half a decade, and Evelise and Lucien's wandering eye were just the latest components slotted into a structure that was already operational long before Serafina found her first piece of evidence. She tore the page from the ledger. Her hands were not gentle. The paper ripped along the binding and came free with a sound like skin separating from a wound. She folded it and placed it inside the folio. Then she went deeper into the archives. The next 2 hours were the loneliest of her life. She moved through the shelves like a woman digging through rubble after a collapse, pulling ledgers, scanning entries, looking for the thread that connected Cresswell's transfer to the arms shipments, to the intelligence leaks, to the web. Verena had spun so carefully that even the spider at the center had become invisible. She found it in pieces. A requisition order for a warehouse in Ashenmore, signed by Cresswell, under a false name, but witnessed by a notary whose seal she recognized from the shipping manifest. A letter of credit from a banking house in the capital, drawn against an account that belonged to a trading company that did not exist, countersigned by Lord Chancellor Whitmore. A personnel file for a woman named Evelise Martel, entered into the royal registry not as a noblewoman but as a diplomatic attaché from the Ryland Confederacy. Her status later amended, the amendment authorized by Verena. Evelise was not a mistress. She was an operative, a diplomatic asset reclassified and inserted into the palace undercover, so thin it should have been transparent, except that no one had ever looked because no one had ever been meant to look. The affair was the disguise. The intimacy with Lucien was not the scandal. It was the shield that made the scandal invisible. Serafina sat on the cold stone floor of the archive, with the documents spread around her like pieces of a map that had been torn apart and scattered by wind. Her back ached. Her eyes were swollen. The candle was almost gone, its flame guttering in a pool of wax that reflected the light back at her in dull golden ripples. She thought about Lucien. Not the king. The man. The man she had married at 21 with a chest full of hope and a head full of the kind of stupidity that only the young and the loved can afford. She thought about his hands on her face the night of their wedding, rough and warm, and the way he had whispered something she could no longer remember against her hair while the capital burned with celebration outside their window. She thought about the first time she heard Evelise's name, spoken by a servant who did not know she was listening, and how the sound of it had entered her body like a splinter, small and sharp and impossible to ignore. He had not known. That was what the documents told her, laid out in the cold language of transfers and requisitions and financial trails. Lucien had been seduced not by a woman but by a weapon, aimed at him by his wife's own stepmother, and he had walked into the trap the way powerful men always walk into traps, believing their desire was their own idea. It did not excuse him. Nothing excused him. But it changed the shape of the betrayal from something simple into something monstrous. And Serafina felt the change move through her like a crack spreading through ice, altering everything it touched. She gathered the documents, all of them, the originals that could not be forged because they carried the watermarks and filing stamps of the Imperial Archive, marks that Verina's copies would not have because Verina had never imagined that Serafina would come down here. She had prepared for the Queen's evidence. She had not prepared for the Empire's. Serafina climbed the stairs out of the archive with the folio pressed against her chest like armor. Dawn was coming. She could feel it in the change of the air, the faint gray that crept along the edges of the corridor windows, the distant sound of roosters from the city below the palace walls. She had perhaps 3 hours before the Grand Council assembled. 3 hours to rebuild a case that had been sabotaged before she ever knew it was being watched. She reached the main corridor and stopped. General Theron was standing outside her chamber door. He was not alone. Beside him stood a young officer she did not recognize, a man with a fresh scar across his left cheek and the hollowed eyes of someone who had not slept. They both turned when they heard her footsteps. "Your Majesty," Theron said. His voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it, a tension she had not heard before, like a rope pulled one turn past safe. "We have a situation." "What kind of situation?" The young officer stepped forward. "Captain Hadley, ma'am. Western Border Garrison. I rode through the night. General Theron ordered me to report directly to you." "Report what?" Hadley swallowed. The scar on his cheek was fresh enough that the movement made it stretch, raw and pink against his wind-burned skin. 3,000 Ryland soldiers crossed the northern river at the Blackstone Ford 6 hours ago. They are moving south through the Ashwood Valley. At their current pace, they will reach the outer farmlands of the capital within 4 days. The words landed like hammer blows. Serafina felt each one in her chest, in her stomach, in the base of her skull, where the body keeps the kind of fear that does not listen to reason. 3,000 soldiers. 4 days. The intelligence Evelis had stolen, the patrol schedules and supply routes that Theron had described, it had not been preparation for probing raids. It had been preparation for an invasion. "How did they cross without detection?" she said. Her voice sounded distant to her own ears, as though it belonged to someone standing in another room. "They used the gap in our patrol rotation at the Blackstone Ford," Hadley said. "A 12-hour window between shift changes. The rotation schedule was supposed to be classified." "It was classified," Theron said. His jaw was tight enough to crack stone. "It was in the dispatches that passed through the king's private chamber 3 months ago. The dispatches Evelis had access to. The dispatches that had been copied and smuggled out of the palace through channels Verina controlled while the entire court was busy whispering about the king's affair, like it was the only story worth telling." Serafina closed her eyes. Behind them, the dark was not empty. It was full of numbers and names and the cold arithmetic of a betrayal so complete that it had rewritten the landscape of the Empire while she was still fighting over documents and council votes. Verina had not just orchestrated a scandal. She had opened the gates. "General," Serafina said, "how many troops can you mobilize within 48 hours? From the capital garrison and the nearest outposts, no more than 1,800. If I send riders to the southern and eastern commands, we might bring that to 4,000 within a week. But a week may be too late." "Then we do not have a week. We have the troops we have." Theron looked at her. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were not. They held the look of a man who was watching someone step off a cliff and trying to decide whether to follow. "Your Majesty, 1,800 men against 3,000, on open ground, with no time to prepare fortifications. The mathematics are not favorable. The mathematics have never been favorable. Not once. Not in any fight I have ever had." She opened her chamber door and walked inside. Theron and Hadley followed. She spread the folio across her desk and laid out the archive documents beside the ones she had already gathered. Originals next to originals. A paper trail so dense and so damning that even Verina's forgeries would crumble against it like sand against stone. "The council meeting happens as planned," she said, "in 3 hours. I present the evidence, all of it, including the archive records Verina does not know I have. But the council meeting is no longer about a scandal. It is about a war. And the court needs to understand that the woman who sold our military secrets to the Ryland Confederacy is sleeping 3 floors above us." "And the king?" Theron asked. Serafina paused. Her hand rested on the manifest, the one that showed the weapons moving through Ashenmoor, the one that had started all of this. She thought about Lucian sitting on his throne yesterday, confused and angry, a man who did not yet know how deeply he had been used. She thought about his face when Roderick named Verena, the doubt in his eyes, the first crack in the armor of a man who had believed himself untouchable. The king needs to be told before the council. He needs to hear it from me, not from a room full of nobles watching for weakness. And if he does not believe you, then I will present the evidence to the council without his support, and the empire will decide who it trusts. A queen with proof or a king with pride. Theron nodded once. Then he turned to Hadley. Captain, return to the western garrison. Tell Commander Aldworth to begin fortification of the Ashwood Valley choke points. No engagement until reinforcements arrive. Defensive positions only. Go. Hadley saluted, turned, and was gone. His boots echoed down the corridor and faded. Seraphina looked at Theron. The general stood in the middle of her chamber, surrounded by evidence of treason and intelligence of invasion and the first gray light of a dawn that felt nothing like a beginning. He looked tired, old in a way that had nothing to do with years and everything to do with the weight of knowing what was coming and being unable to stop it alone. There is one more thing, she said. Tell me. Cresswell came to me last night, in the corridor outside this room. He told me Verena has mirrored my evidence, that she plans to present altered copies to the council that show me as the traitor, not her. Theron's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes went dark and still, the way a lake goes still before a storm rolls over it. He told you this freely. He told me he was delivering a message, and that he is not a loyalist. He is testing which side will pay more. Yes. Can you buy him? I do not need to buy him. I need to make him irrelevant. The archive documents carry imperial watermarks that Verena's copies cannot replicate. The original transfer orders, the financial records, the personnel file for Evelisa Martel, listing her as a Ryland diplomatic asset. These are not documents I collected from informants. These are the Empire's own records, filed by its own clerks, stamped by its own bureaucracy. Verena can forge my evidence. She cannot forge the archive. Theron looked at the documents on the desk. Then he looked at her. And for the second time in 2 days, she saw something on his face that did not belong there. Not hope this time, something fiercer, something closer to the look a man gets when he realizes the person standing in front of him is not who he thought they were. Not better or worse. Just different. Harder. More dangerous. More necessary. Your Majesty, when you go before the king this morning, do not ask for his support. What should I do instead? Tell him the truth. All of it. The affair, the espionage, the arms shipments, the invasion, and then tell him that you are going to save his empire whether he helps you or not. Give him the choice to stand beside you, but make it clear that his answer will not change what you do next. Seraphina held his gaze. The first true light of dawn was breaking through the window now, cutting across the desk in a pale blade that split the documents in half. And in that light, the silver crown on the corner of the desk looked less like a relic and more like something that had been waiting all this time for someone willing to wear its full weight. Theron. Yes. If Lucian chooses wrong this morning, if he stands with Verena, can I count on the army? The question hung between them like smoke. It was the question she had been afraid to ask since the moment she first opened the folio and understood the scale of what was being done to her. It was the question that, once answered, could not be unanswered. Because what she was really asking was whether the Empire's military would follow a queen against a king, and the answer to that question was not a military matter. It was the end of one world and the beginning of another. Theron reached into his coat and pulled out the letter he had been reading when she arrived at the barracks. He unfolded it and placed it on the desk beside the silver crown. It was a list of names, 37 names, every garrison commander, every senior officer, every division leader in the Imperial Army. Beside each name was a single word, written in Theron's own hand, loyal. I began writing this list 6 months ago, he said, when I first reported the guard compromises and watched the reports disappear. I did not know who was responsible. I did not know the scope. But I knew that someone was rotting this empire from the inside, and I knew that when the time came, the only thing standing between the crown and collapse would be the men and women willing to fight for it. Seraphina looked at the list. 37 names. 37 people who had decided, before they knew her name or her plan or the shape of the war she was about to start, that the empire was worth more than the man sitting on its throne. She folded the list and placed it inside the folio with the rest. Then she picked up the silver crown, set it on her head, and walked out the door toward the king's chamber, carrying in her arms the evidence that would either save the empire or destroy the last shred of the life she had known. The corridor stretched before her, long and cold and lit by the thin gray light of a morning that smelled like iron and wet stone. Behind her, Theron's boots fell into step. Ahead, the king's chamber waited at the end of the hall, its doors closed, its guards standing at attention with the vacant obedience of men who had never been asked to choose a side. In less than an hour, they would be asked. And the woman walking toward them with a crown on her head and treason in her hands was no longer the queen they remembered. She was something the Empire had not seen in 100 years, something it had forgotten to fear, something it was about to remember. The guards at the king's door saw her coming and did not move. They stood like posts driven into the stone, their eyes forward, their spears vertical, trained to see nothing that was not their business. Seraphina stopped in front of them and waited. She did not ask. She did not announce herself. She stood with the silver crown on her head and the folio against her chest, and the full weight of what she carried pressing down on her shoulders like a yoke made of iron and truth, and she waited until the silence became a question neither guard could ignore. The one on the left broke first. His eyes flicked to the crown, then to her face, then to Theron standing behind her with the stillness of a man who had stopped pretending this was a normal morning. "Your Majesty, the king has not yet. Open the door." He opened the door. The king's chamber was dark. Heavy curtains blocked the windows, and the air inside was thick with the smell of wine and sweat and the particular staleness of a room where a man had been sleeping badly for a long time. Lucian was sitting on the edge of his bed in a linen shirt and breeches, barefoot, his hair uncombed, a half-empty goblet on the nightstand beside him. He looked up when the door opened and his face moved through three expressions in rapid succession: surprise, irritation, then something harder, something that settled over his features like a mask being fitted into place. "It is not yet dawn, Seraphina. It is past dawn. You have been sleeping through it." She crossed the room and pulled the curtains open. Gray light flooded in, merciless and flat, and Lucian flinched against it the way a man flinches when someone lights a torch in a room he has been hiding in. She saw him clearly now. The hollows beneath his eyes, the broken capillaries across his cheeks from too many nights with the goblet, the softness around his jaw that had not been there when she married him. 7 years of indulgence had blurred the edges of the man she remembered, and standing here in the cold morning light, she could see exactly how much of him had been eroded by the slow current of his own appetites. "We need to talk," she said, "and you need to be sober for it." "I am sober." "You are holding a wine goblet at 6 in the morning." He looked at the goblet. Then he set it down with a deliberate care that was meant to communicate control and communicated the opposite. "Say what you came to say." Seraphina placed the folio on the table between them. She did not open it. Not yet. She needed him to hear it first, the full shape of it, spoken aloud in a room where there were no nobles watching and no court to perform for. She needed him to understand before she proved it. "Evelis is not your mistress, Lucian. She is a Ryland intelligence operative placed in this palace by your stepmother to extract military secrets from your private chambers. The affair was engineered, every meeting scheduled, every guard paid off, every route through the palace arranged by Lady Verena through an intermediary named Cresswell, who has been embedded in your household for 5 years. The intelligence Evelis gathered, patrol schedules, supply routes, troop positions, was transmitted to the Ryland Confederacy through arms smuggling channels disguised as grain shipments moving through the port of Ashenmore. 6 hours ago, 3,000 Ryland soldiers crossed the Blackstone Ford, using the exact gap in our patrol rotation that was detailed in dispatches from your private chamber." She stopped. The silence in the room was not empty. It was loaded, pressurized, the silence of a space where something has been detonated and the shockwave has not yet reached the walls. Lucian stared at her. His face had gone the color of old paper. His hands, resting on his knees, had curled into fists so tight the tendons stood out like cables. "That is not possible," he said. His voice was flat. Not angry, not defensive, flat. The voice of a man whose mind is rejecting information faster than his body can process it. "It is not only possible, it is documented." She opened the folio and laid out the archive records. The transfer order for Cresswell, the financial trail through the shell merchants, Evelis's original registry entry listing her as a Ryland diplomatic attaché, the shipping manifest with the weight discrepancies that proved weapons, not grain, had moved through Ashenmore under Verena's seal. These are not copies, these are originals from the Imperial Archive, watermarked, filed by palace clerks, stamped with dates that predate my investigation by years. Verena cannot forge these because she did not know they existed. Lucian picked up the personnel file. His hands were shaking. She watched his eyes move across the page, watched the information enter him like a blade pushed slowly between ribs, watched the precise moment when denial became impossible, and something inside him buckled. He set the file down. Verena. Yes, she did this. She has been doing this for 5 years. You were the instrument, Lucian, not the architect. She needed someone close to you who could access your military dispatches without raising suspicion. A mistress in your bed was the simplest solution. You provided the access. Evelise provided the intelligence. Verena provided the network to move it out of the palace and into enemy hands. Lucien stood. The movement was sudden and violent, and the nightstand toppled, sending the goblet crashing to the floor where it shattered and sent wine spreading across the stone like a wound opening. He turned away from her and pressed both hands flat against the wall, his shoulders heaving, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts that sounded like a man trying to keep his chest from splitting open. She let him have it. The rage, the shame, the understanding that every night he had spent with Evelise, every whispered intimacy, every moment he had believed was his own private rebellion against a marriage, he found suffocating. All of it had been choreographed by a woman who sat at his dinner table and called him son. She let him feel the full scale of it because he needed to feel it. A man who did not feel the wound would not fight to close it. How long have you known? He said without turning around. 3 months. 3 months. He let out a sound that was not quite a laugh. It was raw and cracked and ugly, the sound of a man who had just discovered that the ground he was standing on was not ground at all, but the lid of something hollow and rotten. You sat across from me at dinner for 3 months. You smiled at me. You attended council sessions. You stood beside me at the harvest ceremony and waved to the crowd. And you knew, this whole time. Yes. Why did you not tell me? Because I did not trust you. He turned. His eyes were wet. Not with tears. With the particular burn that comes from holding something back so hard it scalds the inside of your face. You did not trust me. You were sleeping with a woman another person put in your bed and you did not notice. You signed military dispatches and left them on your desk while a stranger lay beside you, and you did not think. For 7 years you ruled this empire with the assumption that loyalty was something you deserved instead of something you earned. No, Lucian, I did not trust you. I did not have that luxury. The words hit him like a hand across the face. She saw the impact in his body, in the way his shoulders dropped and his jaw clenched, and his eyes went from burning to something darker, something that looked like a man staring at his own reflection in water he was about to drown in. The council meets in less than 2 hours, she said. Verena has prepared forged documents that mirror my evidence but name me as the traitor instead of her. She expects me to present my case, and then she will present hers, and the council will be forced to choose between 2 versions of the truth. But my version is backed by Imperial Archive records that carry authentication marks her forgeries cannot replicate. I will destroy her case, and then I will demand a full investigation into the intelligence breach, the arms shipments, and the Ryland invasion force that is currently 4 days from our capital. Lucian was quiet for a long time. He stood with his back against the wall, and his hands at his sides and his face carrying the weight of every mistake he had ever made, visible now in the morning light like cracks in plaster that had been painted over too many times. What do you need from me? I need you to stand beside me at the council. Not behind me, not in front of me, beside me. And I need you to strip Verena of her titles and her household authority before she enters the room. If she walks in with the status of a royal family member, her word carries weight. If she walks in stripped of rank, she is just another accused. You want me to condemn my own stepmother before the trial. I want you to protect your empire. Those are the same thing right now. He closed his eyes. The muscles in his jaw worked. She could see the battle happening inside him, the war between the man who wanted to believe the world was simpler than this, and the king who was beginning to understand that it never had been. When he opened his eyes, something had changed. Not everything, not enough, but something. I will stand beside you. And Verena? I will sign the order before the council. Serafina held his gaze for a long moment. She did not thank him. Thanks were for gifts freely given, and this was not a gift. This was a debt being paid by a man who was only beginning to understand how much he owed. She gathered the folio and walked to the door. Theron was waiting in the corridor, his face unreadable, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. He is with us, she said. For now. For now is enough. The Grand Council chamber was built to intimidate. Vaulted ceilings of dark stone, iron chandeliers holding 100 candles each. their light falling in pools that left the edges of the room in permanent shadow. A long table of black oak dominated the center, scarred by generations of fists and daggers, and the occasional goblet thrown in anger. The seats around it were high-backed and hard, designed for endurance, not comfort, because the men and women who sat in them were expected to make decisions that would outlast their own discomfort. Serafina arrived first. She took the seat at the head of the table, the seat traditionally reserved for the monarch, and placed the folio in front of her. The silver crown sat heavy on her brow. She felt its weight not as burden but as ballast, the thing that kept her anchored to the floor when every nerve in her body wanted to fly apart. The nobles filed in over the next half hour. Lord Dunmore, red-faced and sweating before the session even began. Lady Marcella, her eyes moving across the room like a hawk scanning a field for movement. Lord Ashton, grey and silent, a man who had survived 30 years at court by never being the first to speak or the last to leave. A dozen others, each carrying the particular expression of someone who has been summoned to witness something they cannot predict and cannot avoid. General Theron stood at the north wall with 4 soldiers in full armor, not ceremonial. Battle ready. The message was not subtle. Lucien entered through the east door. He was dressed in the formal black of a reigning monarch, his crown polished, his face set in an expression that gave nothing away. He walked to the head of the table and stopped when he saw Serafina already seated in his chair. For one terrible second, the room held its breath. Then Lucien pulled out the chair to her right and sat down. The murmur that passed through the council was not a whisper. It was a tremor. The king had yielded the head of the table to the queen. In the grammar of imperial power, that sentence had only one translation. "Where is Lady Verena?" Lord Dunmore asked, his voice cracking at the edges. "Lady Verena's titles and household authority were revoked by royal order 1 hour ago," Lucien said. His voice was steady, but Serafina could hear the effort it cost him, the way each word was being lifted from somewhere heavy and dark. "She will be escorted to this chamber under guard to answer charges that will be presented by the Queen." The tremor became a quake. Nobles leaned toward each other. Hands gripped armrests. Lady Marcella's fan snapped shut with a sound like a bone breaking. The east door opened again and Verena entered. She was flanked by 2 soldiers, but she walked between them as though they were servants holding a door. Her chin was high. Her back was straight. Her gown was immaculate, dark blue silk with silver embroidery, chosen for this moment with the precision of a woman who understood that appearance was the last weapon left when all others had been taken. Her eyes found Serafina immediately and held. Serafina looked back. She saw the woman who had raised her, the woman who had braided her hair and corrected her posture and taught her to smile when she wanted to scream. She saw the lines around her mouth and the steel in her spine and the absolute, unbreakable refusal to bend, and she understood with a clarity that tasted like copper on her tongue that she was looking at a version of herself, a version that had chosen power over people, a version that had decided, at some point in the long and brutal arithmetic of survival, that the Empire was a machine and everyone inside it was a part to be used or discarded. Serafina had been becoming that version. Night by night, document by document, in the cold dark of the archives and the colder dark of her own isolation. The folio in front of her was proof of how far she had traveled down that road. And the woman standing at the far end of the table, stripped of rank but not of menace, was proof of where that road ended. "Be seated, Lady Verena," Serafina said. "I prefer to stand." It was not a suggestion. Verena sat. The chair scraped against the stone floor, and the sound cut through the room like a blade across glass. Serafina opened the folio. She laid the documents out one by one, in sequence, each one placed on the table with the deliberate care of a surgeon laying out instruments before an operation. She did not rush. She did not explain. She let the documents speak first, and then she spoke over them, narrating the conspiracy the way a general narrates a battlefield, with precision and without mercy. The financial trails. The guard payments. Cresswell's transfer order. The shipping manifests from Ashenmore. The weight discrepancies that proved weapons, not grain. The banking records that looped through shell companies back to accounts controlled by Verena. And finally, the personnel file. Evelise Martel, diplomatic attaché. Ryland Confederacy, reclassified and inserted into the palace under the direct authorization of Lady Verena Ashford. The room was silent. Not the silence of shock. The silence of a structure failing, of load-bearing walls cracking under a weight they were not designed to hold. Nobles stared at the documents. Some reached forward to touch them, as though physical contact could make the truth more or less real. Verena did not move. Her face was composed, arranged in the serene expression of a woman who had expected this and prepared for it and was waiting for her moment to strike. Serafina knew the expression, had worn versions of it herself, and she knew what was coming. "Your Majesty," Verena said. Her voice was cool and unhurried. "May I respond?" "You may." Verena reached inside her gown and produced a leather case. She opened it and drew out a sheaf of documents that she placed on the table beside Serafina's. "I anticipated this accusation. These are records showing that every transaction, every payment, every shipment the Queen has described was in fact authorized not by me, but by the Queen herself. The signatures, the seals, the financial authorizations, all traceable to the Queen's private accounts and her personal agents." She fanned the documents across the table with the practiced ease of a card player laying down a winning hand. "The Queen has been conducting an espionage operation against her own empire and is now attempting to frame me to cover her treason. I present these documents to the Council and request an immediate investigation." The room erupted. Voices crashed against each other like waves in a storm. Lord Dunmore was on his feet, shouting something about procedure. Lady Marcella was speaking rapidly to the man beside her. Lord Ashton had gone so pale, he looked like he was about to slide out of his chair. Serafina let the chaos run. 10 seconds. 15. Long enough for the fear to peak. Then she raised her hand. Quiet. The room obeyed. Not because of the word, because of the voice that carried it. Low and flat and final, the voice of a woman who had walked through fire and come out the other side with nothing left to burn. "Lord Chancellor Whitmore, step forward." A thin man in the third row of seats went rigid. His face lost all color. He did not move. "Now, Lord Chancellor." Whitmore stood. His legs were visibly trembling. He walked to the head of the table and stopped, his eyes darting between Serafina and Verena like a trapped animal looking for a gap in the fence. "Lord Chancellor, you serve as the keeper of the Imperial Seal. Every document bearing that seal passes through your office for authentication. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Majesty." "Then examine these documents." She pushed Verena's papers toward him. "Tell the Council whether these bear authentic imperial watermarks and filing stamps consistent with palace records." Whitmore's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the papers. He lifted them to the light. He turned them. He held them close to his face and then at arm's length. The room watched. The silence was suffocating. "These," he swallowed. His Adam's apple bobbed like a cork in rough water. "These documents bear the imperial seal. But the watermarks are inconsistent with standard archive filing. The paperweight is correct, but the filing stamps they appear to be reproductions, high quality, but reproductions. And these?" Serafina pushed her own documents forward. "The originals from the archive, the ones pulled from shelves where they had sat for years, undisturbed, carrying the full authentication of the Empire's own bureaucracy." Whitmore examined them. His hands stopped shaking. Something moved across his face. The particular relief of a man who has just been given permission to tell the truth. "These are authentic, original filings, the watermarks, the paper, the filing stamps, the ink composition. These are genuine imperial records." Serafina turned to Verena. The older woman's face had not changed, the composure held, but beneath it, in the faintest tremor of her lower lip, in the way her left hand gripped the edge of the table hard enough to whiten her knuckles, Serafina could see the first fracture. The first crack in a wall that had taken decades to build. "Lady Verena, your documents are forgeries. The Council has heard expert testimony confirming it. You inserted a Ryland operative into the King's bed, used her access to steal military intelligence, smuggled weapons through Ashenmoor, and opened the door for an invasion force that is now 4 days from this capital. You did this while sitting at the royal table and calling yourself family." Verena's eyes burned. Her jaw tightened, and when she spoke, her voice had changed. The composure was gone. What remained was raw and old and ugly, the voice of a woman who had spent a lifetime accumulating power and was watching it bleed out between her fingers. "You know nothing about what it takes to hold this family together. Nothing. I built us. I built our position. I built everything you are standing on, and you sold us to the enemy. I secured our future. You armed the men who are coming to destroy us. I armed the men who will replace a king too weak to rule and a queen too soft to lead. The Ryland alliance was supposed to bring order, discipline, a new dynasty with the strength to hold this empire together instead of watching it rot under the weight of your husband's incompetence and your insufferable patience." The words fell across the council table like a body dropped from a height. Every noble in the room understood what Verena had just said. Not a denial, a confession. Dressed in the language of justification, wrapped in the desperate logic of a woman who had convinced herself that treason was strategy, but a confession nonetheless. Lucien rose from his chair. His face was a thing Serafina had never seen before, stripped of every mask, every performance, every layer of royal composure. What was underneath was not rage. It was something more frightening. It was the face of a man who had just heard the truth about his own irrelevance spoken aloud by the woman who had profited from it the longest. "Guards," he said. His voice did not shake. "Take Lady Verena to the tower. She will be held under military guard pending a full tribunal." Verena stood. The soldiers moved toward her. She looked at Serafina one last time, and in that look was something Serafina would carry for the rest of her life. Not hatred, not defeat. Recognition. The recognition of one predator looking at another and understanding, finally, that the younger one had grown teeth sharp enough to bite. The soldiers took her arms. She did not resist. She walked out of the council chamber with her back straight and her chin high, and the door closed behind her with a sound that echoed through the vaulted ceiling like the last note of a song that had been playing for far too long. Serafina stood at the head of the table. The folio lay open before her, the silver crown pressed against her skull. Around her, 30 faces waited. The Ryland Confederacy has 3,000 soldiers moving through the Ashwood Valley. They will reach the capital in 4 days. General Theron has 1,800 troops mobilized and fortification of the valley choke points has begun. But we are outnumbered, undersupplied, and we have been bleeding intelligence to the enemy for months. They know our positions, they know our strength, they know our weaknesses. She paused. The room was so quiet she could hear the candles burning in the chandeliers above. "I am not going to lie to you. The mathematics are against us. The time is against us. And the woman who caused this damage sat among us for years while we did nothing. That failure belongs to all of us. Every person in this room who saw something wrong and stayed silent. Every noble who heard a rumor and looked the other way. Every officer who filed a report that disappeared. We built this disaster together, one silence at a time." She placed both hands flat on the table. "Now we fight our way out of it, together, or we fall." Then Captain Hadley burst through the council doors, his face white, his uniform streaked with road dust and something darker. He did not salute. He did not bow. He grabbed the edge of the table and spoke in the voice of a man who had ridden so hard his lungs were bleeding. "The Ryland vanguard has broken through the Ashwood line. They are not 4 days out. They are 2. Commander Aldworth is dead. The western garrison is in full retreat." The room did not erupt. It froze. Every body, every breath, every heartbeat suspended in the terrible space between hearing a thing and believing it. Serafina looked at Theron. Theron looked at her. 2 days. 1,800 men. An enemy that already knew everything. And the only thing standing between the capital and annihilation was a queen wearing a crown that had not been tested in 100 years, leading an empire that had forgotten what it meant to fight for something worth keeping. The council chamber emptied in 60 seconds. Nobles scattered like birds flushed from a hedgerow, some toward their estates to gather household guards, others toward the city gates to flee before the roads choked with refugees. Lord Dunmore knocked his chair backward in his rush to leave and did not stop to right it. Lady Marcella walked out with the measured pace of a woman who had already calculated exactly how far her fastest horse could carry her before nightfall. Only Lord Ashton remained seated, his hands folded on the table, his gray face turned toward Serafina with an expression that held neither fear nor hope, but the grim patience of a man who had decided that running was beneath him. Serafina did not watch them go. She was already standing over the table with Theron, a map of the Ashwood Valley spread between them, marking positions with the blunt end of a quill. "The valley narrows here," Theron said, pressing his finger into a crease in the map, where 2 ridgelines converged. "Harrow's Gap, 1/2 a mile wide. Steep ground on both sides, heavy timber. If they are moving in column formation, they will have to funnel through." "Can we hold it? With 1,800 men and enough time to dig in, we can hold it long enough to break their momentum. But holding is not winning. We stop them at the gap, they regroup, probe the flanks, find another route. We need to do more than hold. We need to make them decide this is not worth the cost." Serafina stared at the map. The lines and contours blurred and sharpened as her mind moved through possibilities, the way water moves through cracks, finding every opening, testing every weakness. She had never commanded troops. She had never stood on a battlefield. But she had spent 7 years navigating a court that operated on the same principles: misdirection, leverage, the exploitation of what your enemy believed versus what was true. "They think we are broken," she said. Aldworth is dead. The Western garrison is retreating. Their intelligence told them our patrol schedules and our supply lines and the exact size of our standing force. They believe they are marching into a kingdom with its throat already cut. They are not wrong. They are wrong about one thing. They do not know about the Silver Crown. They do not know what happened in this chamber today. They believe Verena is still operational, still feeding them information, still managing their approach from inside the palace. As far as the Ryland command knows, the door is still open. Theron looked at her. The quill stopped moving. You want to use that? I want to send them a message that the door is closed, and I want them to receive it in a way that costs them more than they can afford. She turned to Lucien. He was standing 3 paces behind them, his face tight, his hands at his sides. He had not spoken since Hadley's announcement. The look on his face was the look of a man standing in the wreckage of a house he had always assumed someone else was maintaining, seeing for the first time all the places where the beams had rotted through. Lucien, I need the royal banner. What? The royal banner. Your personal standard. The one that flies above the column when the king rides to war. I need it at Harrow's Gap before the Ryland vanguard arrives. Understood. She could see the understanding move through him like a shudder, and with it something else, something that straightened his spine and pulled his shoulders back and made him look, for just a moment, like the man she had married. You want them to see the king on the field. I want them to see the empire on the field. Every banner, every standard, every flag we have. If they are expecting a wounded kingdom crawling toward collapse, we give them the opposite. We give them a wall. 1,800 men is not a wall. 1,800 men standing behind their king and queen in a narrow pass with nowhere to retreat is the most dangerous thing on any battlefield, because an army that cannot run does not need courage. It only needs rage. And after what Verena did to this empire, there is enough rage in this capital to burn the world. Theron almost smiled again. The same near miss as before, the same aborted twitch at the corner of his mouth. Then he rolled up the map and issued orders with the efficiency of a man who had been waiting his entire career for a monarch worth following. They rode out at noon. The column moved fast through the capital and onto the western road, 1,800 soldiers in battle formation, with Seraphina and Lucien at the head. She had traded the emerald gown for riding leather and a breastplate borrowed from the palace armory, too large for her frame, but cinched tight with straps that dug into her shoulders. The silver crown sat on her head beneath a steel helm. The wind off the plains was cold and sharp and smelled like wet grass and iron, and the sound of 1,800 horses and boots hitting packed earth rolled across the countryside like thunder dragged along the ground. They reached Harrow's Gap by dusk of the following day. The terrain was exactly what Theron had described. 2 ridgelines converging like the walls of a funnel, heavy pine forest climbing the slopes on both sides, a narrow valley floor of hard-packed dirt and river stones. A place where numbers meant less than nerve. Theron positioned the infantry across the gap in 3 staggered lines, shields locked, spears angled forward. Archers took the high ground on both ridges, hidden among the trees. Cavalry held in reserve behind the 3rd line, ready to punch through any breach or wheel around the flanks if the opportunity presented itself. It was a defensive formation built for one purpose: to absorb a charge and make the enemy pay for every foot of ground with blood they could not spare. Seraphina stood at the front of the first line, not behind it, not on the ridge with the archers. At the front, where the soldiers could see her, where the enemy would see her, where the silver crown would catch the light and tell every man on that field exactly who was standing between them and the capital. Lucien stood beside her. He had not argued. He had not suggested she move to the rear. He had simply taken his position at her right side, drawn his sword, and waited. The blade was steady in his hand. Whatever he was feeling, fear, shame, the desperate need to prove something to the woman beside him, he had locked it behind the same granite face his ancestors had worn into battle for generations. It was not bravery. It was the understanding that bravery was no longer the point. The point was presence, being here, being visible, being willing to die in the same dirt as the people he had failed. The Ryland vanguard appeared at the far end of the valley just before the last light died. Torches first, a river of fire flowing between the dark ridgelines. Then the sound, boots, steel, the low rhythmic chant that armies use to keep pace on a march, a sound that vibrated in the chest and turned the air into something you could feel pressing against your ribs. 3,000 soldiers, moving in tight column formation, banners she did not recognize, armor that glinted in the torchlight like the scales of something cold and patient that had crawled out of the dark to feed. They stopped when they saw the gap. Serafina watched the column halt, watched the front ranks slow and compress as word traveled backward through the formation. She could not see faces at this distance, but she could feel the hesitation, the recalculation, the moment when an army expecting open road encounters a locked door. An hour passed. Then two. The Ryland force did not advance. They made camp at the far end of the valley. Their fires spread across the plain like a second set of stars, low and orange and restless. Serafina stood at the front line and watched them and felt the cold settle into her armor and her bones and the place behind her eyes where exhaustion lived. She did not sleep. Neither did the soldiers around her. They stood or crouched in the dark, breathing into their hands, checking the edges of their blades, speaking in low voices about the things men speak about before a battle they do not expect to survive. She listened. A young soldier, 3 positions to her left, was telling the man beside him about a girl he had promised to marry when he got back. His voice was steady, but his hands were not. She watched him tighten and retighten the strap on his shield until the leather creaked, and she thought about every person in this line who had a reason to be somewhere else and had chosen to be here instead. That was the thing about standing at the edge. You did not become brave. You became honest. Every lie you had ever told yourself about what mattered and what did not fell away like dead skin, and what was left was raw and simple and true. These people were here because they believed the thing behind them was worth defending, not the palace, not the crown, not the king or the queen or the political machinery that had almost destroyed them all. They were defending the idea that their lives meant something, that the place they called home was more than a piece of ground to be traded between powers that did not know their names. Serafina felt that truth settle into her the way the cold had settled into her armor, deep and permanent and impossible to ignore. She had started this fight to protect herself, to survive Verena's betrayal and Lucian's weakness and the suffocating loneliness of a woman abandoned in plain sight. But standing here in the dark, surrounded by people who had followed her into a gap they might not walk out of, she understood that the fight had become something larger than survival. It had become the thing that survival was for. Dawn came slow and gray. Fog filled the valley floor like smoke, thick enough to muffle sound, thin enough to let the shapes of the Ryland formation emerge at the far end like ghosts assembling for a war they had already won. They advanced at first light. The charge hit the front line with a sound Serafina would never forget. Steel against bone against earth. A noise that was not loud so much as total, filling every space, replacing every thought with the single screaming reality of bodies in collision. The first line buckled, held, buckled again. Men fell. Others stepped into the gaps. The archers on the ridges loosed volley after volley into the compressed Ryland column, arrows falling like rain made of iron, and the screams that rose from the valley floor were not the screams of war stories. They were the screams of living things being torn apart. Serafina fought, not with skill, not with grace, with the desperate, ugly efficiency of a woman who had never held a sword in battle before, and who understood, in the first 30 seconds of contact, that fighting was nothing like she had imagined. It was slower and faster at the same time, heavier, wetter. The blade in her hand connected with things she could feel through the hilt, impacts that traveled up her arm and into her shoulder and lodged there like shrapnel. Her vision narrowed to the space directly in front of her, a face, an arm, a shield rim swinging toward her head. She ducked, struck, felt something give, struck again. Lucien was beside her. She heard him before she saw him, a ragged shout that was not a word but a sound, the sound of a man who had found the bottom of himself and discovered that it was not empty. He fought like he had something to prove to every person on that field, and to himself most of all, and the soldiers around him fought harder for seeing it, the way a fire burns hotter when new fuel is thrown into its center. The battle lasted 4 hours. It felt like 4 years. The Ryland column could not deploy. Harrow's Gap compressed them into a front no wider than the Imperial lines, and their numerical advantage became a liability as the rear ranks pushed forward into troops that had no room to maneuver. The archers on the ridges poured fire into the packed formation until the arrows ran out, and then Theron sent the cavalry around the eastern ridge, in a flanking sweep that hit the Ryland rear like a hammer striking an anvil. The column fractured, units broke, command structure collapsed as officers fell or lost contact with their flanks. By midday, the Ryland force was in full retreat. They left the valley the way they had entered it, in column, but now the column was ragged and bleeding and missing a third of its strength. The Imperial forces did not pursue. They did not have the numbers. They stood in the gap and watched the enemy withdraw, and the silence that followed was not the silence of victory. It was the silence of people who had just learned what they were capable of, and were not sure whether to be proud or terrified. Serafina stood in the center of the gap. Her armor was dented and streaked with dirt and blood that was not all hers. The silver crown had been knocked sideways by an impact she did not remember taking, and she reached up and straightened it with fingers that trembled so badly she had to use both hands. Her legs ached. Her lungs burned. A cut across her left forearm had bled through the leather bracer and dried into a dark crust that cracked when she moved. She looked at the field. Bodies lay in the mud, and the fog, and the early afternoon light that was finally breaking through the overcast, and she felt something open inside her that she did not have a name for. Not grief, not relief. Something older and harder, the feeling of having crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed, and knowing that the person standing on this side of it is not the person who stood on the other. Theron found her there. He was bleeding from a wound above his right ear, and his sword arm hung at an angle that suggested something was broken or badly strained, but he was upright and his eyes were clear. "They will not come back," he said. "Not through this pass, not this season. The losses are too heavy, and their intelligence network is gone. Without Verena feeding them information, they are blind." "And next season?" "Next season we will be ready. You have bought this empire the time it needed." She looked at him. "We bought it." He nodded once. That was all. It was enough. The ride back to the capital took 2 days. The column moved slowly, burdened with wounded, and Serafina rode at the front with Lucian beside her and the silver crown on her head, and the folio still strapped to her saddle, though it no longer felt like a weapon. It felt like a record, a document of who she had been and who she had become, and the distance between the two. The capital welcomed them with a sound she was not prepared for, cheering, thousands of voices rising from the city walls and the rooftops and the crowded streets, a sound that hit her chest like a wave and nearly knocked her from the saddle. She had not expected it. She had expected silence or suspicion or the careful neutrality of people who did not yet know which way the wind was blowing. But the city had heard. The riders Theron sent ahead had carried the news, and the news had spread the way fire spreads through dry grass, fast and total and impossible to contain. The Queen had fought. The Queen had stood at the front. The Queen had held the gap. Serafina rode through the gates and did not wave. She did not smile. She looked at the faces lining the road and saw in them something she had never seen directed at herself before. Not admiration, not reverence. Trust. The simple, hard-won trust of people who had watched someone risk what they risked and bleed where they bled and refused to stand behind a wall while others died in front of it. That evening, in the quiet of her chamber, she sat at the desk where the folio had first been opened and stared at the wall. The silver crown sat beside her. The leather armor lay in a heap on the floor, stiff with dried mud and someone else's blood. She had bathed, but she could still smell the battlefield on her skin, in her hair, in the creases of her knuckles. It would take days to wash out. Maybe longer. Maybe the smell never left entirely. Maybe that was the point. A knock at the door. Soft, hesitant. The knock of someone who was not sure they had the right to be there. "Come in." Lucien entered. He had cleaned up, but the evidence of the battle was still on him. A bruise across his jaw. A bandaged cut on his left hand. The particular stiffness of a man whose body had been used in ways it was not accustomed to. He stood in the doorway and looked at her, and the distance between them was not the distance of anger or betrayal. It was the distance of two people who had been through something that had stripped away everything except what was real. "I do not know how to begin," he said. "Then do not begin. Just say what is true." He walked to the chair across from her and sat down. His elbows rested on his knees. His hands hung between them, open and empty, the hands of a man who had nothing left to hold on to except the truth. "I failed you. Not because I was deceived, because I chose not to look. I chose comfort over attention. I chose my own appetite over the woman standing beside me. And every night I spent pretending the world was smaller than it was, you were down here in the dark, alone, doing the work I should have been doing." Serafina listened. She did not interrupt. She did not soften. She let the words land where they landed and felt their weight and measured it against the weight she had been carrying alone for 7 years. "I am not asking you to forgive me," he said. "I'm asking you to let me earn back what I destroyed. Not as your king, as your partner, whatever that looks like, however long it takes." She looked at him for a long time. She saw the boy she had married and the man he had failed to become, and the man he might still be if he was willing to do the work. She saw his flaws the way she now saw her own, not as weaknesses to be hidden, but as the raw material of something that could be built if both of them had the courage to build it. Equal authority, she said, over the empire, over the council, over every decision that passes through this palace. Not because you are giving it to me, because I took it, and because this empire will not survive another season of being ruled by half its strength. Yes. And Evelisa, banished before sunrise. Her name struck from every record. She does not exist in this empire anymore. I will sign the order tonight. You will sign it now. He looked at her. Then he reached for the quill on her desk and the parchment beside it, and wrote the order in his own hand, signed it, sealed it, and placed it in front of her. His hand was steady. His eyes were clear. It was not enough. It was a beginning. Months passed. The empire healed the way all wounded things heal, slowly, unevenly, with scars that ached in cold weather and memories that surfaced without warning. Corrupt nobles who had profited from Verina's network were identified, tried, and stripped of their holdings. The Guard Corps was rebuilt from the ground up under Theron's command. Trade routes were secured. The northern border was fortified with permanent garrisons that answered to the crown, not to local lords with flexible loyalties. Verina stood trial before a tribunal of 12. The evidence was overwhelming. The archive documents, the financial trails, the testimony of Cresswell, who had indeed been purchased, and who spoke with the dispassionate clarity of a man describing someone else's crime. Verina was convicted of treason, stripped of her name, and sentenced to exile in a territory so remote that the maps did not bother to name it. She walked out of the tribunal without looking back. Serafina watched her go and felt the last thread of something old and painful snap inside her chest, not with relief, but with the quiet finality of a door closing on a room she would never need to enter again. The victory celebration was held on the first day of autumn, when the leaves in the capital had turned gold and red, and the air carried the sharp edge of a season that did not forgive weakness. The entire city gathered in the central square. Soldiers who had fought at Harrow's Gap stood in formation along the main avenue. Citizens packed the balconies and rooftops. Children sat on their parents' shoulders, pointing at the banners and the horses, and the woman at the center of it all. Serafina stood on the steps of the palace with the silver crown on her head, and Lucien beside her. He was different now, quieter, more careful with his words and his attention and the way he moved through the world. He had begun attending every council session. He had begun listening. He had begun doing the small, unglamorous work of earning back trust one decision at a time. And Serafina could see the effort in him, the way you can see new growth on a tree that has been cut back to the trunk. Tentative, green, real. She looked out at the crowd and felt something settle inside her. Not peace. She did not trust peace. Peace was what people called the space between storms, and she had learned too well that storms did not announce themselves. What she felt was steadier than peace. It was the knowledge of her own strength, tested and proven, and no longer dependent on anyone else's belief. She had walked into the dark alone. She had found what she needed in the archives and on the battlefield and in the cold, honest center of her own will. She had broken and rebuilt herself in the same motion, like a bone that heals stronger at the fracture line. Lucien reached for her hand. She let him take it. Not because she needed it, because she chose it. And the difference between those two things was the entire distance she had traveled. The crowd roared. The banners snapped in the autumn wind. And somewhere in the capital, in a kitchen or a stable or a room with no windows, a woman who had been watching everything and saying nothing looked at her daughter and told her the story of the queen who wore the silver crown. Not the version the court would tell, polished and political and careful. The real version. The one about a woman who spent 7 years being underestimated and 3 months gathering proof in the dark, and one terrible night learning that even her proof had been turned against her. The one about standing in a gap with a sword she barely knew how to hold and refusing to step behind the line. The one about what it costs to become the person you were always capable of being, and how the cost is worth it every single time, not because the ending is happy, but because the ending is yours. The sun went down over the capital. The celebration continued into the night, and the queen, who had nearly been destroyed by the people closest to her, stood on the steps of the palace she had saved and watched the lights of her empire burn against the dark, steady and bright and unafraid.